Hello everybody, welcome into my new viewers and welcome back to my Serendipity Subbies. Today is September 13th, 2022, and I would like to bring you this day in history. After decades of bloody animosity, representatives of Israel and Palestine meet on the south lawn of the White House and sign a framework for peace. The Declaration of Principle was the first agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians toward ending their conflict and sharing the Holy Land between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea that they both claim as their homeland. Fighting between Jews and Arabs in Palestine dates back to the 1920s, when both groups laid claim to British-controlled territories. The Jews were Zionist, recently immigrated from Europe and Russia, who came to the ancient homeland of the Jews to establish a Jewish national state. The native Arabs, they did not yet call themselves Palestinians, sought to stem Jewish immigration and set up a secular Palestinian state. On May 14, 1948, the State of Israel was proclaimed, and 5 Arab nations attacked in support of Palestinian Arabs. Israelites fought off Arab armies and seized substantial territory originally allocated to the Arabs in 1947. United Nations partition of Palestine. After 2 consecutive UN brokered ceasefire, the State of Israel reached a formal armistice agreement with Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria in February 1949. These agreements left Israel in permanent control of the territory it had conquered during the conflict. The departure of hundreds of thousands of Palestine Arabs from Israel during the war left the country with a substantial Jewish majority. Israel restricted the rights of the Arabs who remained. Most Palestinian Arabs who left Israel territory retreated to the West Bank, then controlled the Transjordan, present-day Jordan, and others to the Gaza Strip, controlled by Egypt. Hundreds of thousands of exiled Palestinians moved permanently to refugee camps. By early 1960s, Palestinian Arabs diaspora had formed a cohesive national identity. In 1964, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, was formed as a political umbrella organization for several Palestinian groups and meant to represent all the Palestinian people. The PLO called for destruction of the state of Israel and the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. In the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel seized control of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, and Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. Israel permanently annexed East Jerusalem and set up military administration in the occupied territories. Although Israel offered to return some of the territory seized in return for the security requirements of Israel, the Arab League opted against formal negotiations in the KHARTOUM resolution on September 1st, 1967. The Sinai was later returned to Egypt in 1979 as part of an Israeli-Egyptian peace agreement, but the rest of the occupied territories remained under Israeli control. A fraction of Israelis called for permanent annexation of these regions, and in the late 70s, nationalist Jews settlers moved into the territories as a means of accomplishments. Accomplishing this aim. After the 1967 war, the PLO was recognized as a symbol of the Palestinian national movement, and the PLO chairman Yasser Arafat organized guerrilla attacks on Israel from the PLO base in Jordan, and after 1970 from Lebanon. The PLO also coordinated terrorist attacks against Israelis at home and abroad. The Palestinian guerrilla and terrorist activity provoked heavy reprisals from Israel armed forces and intelligence services. By the late 1970s, Arafat won the international acceptance of the PLO, and the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Egypt and Syria forced launches against Egypt and Syria forces launched an attack against Israel on Yom Kippur on 1973 in an attempt to regain land lost during the Third Arabian-Israeli War. A ceasefire went into effect on October 25, 1973. On September 17, 1978, after nearly 2 weeks of secret negotiations at Camp David, Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin signed the Camp David Accord, the first peace agreement between Israel and one of its Arab neighbors. The accord sought to establish a framework for peace in the Middle East, and both countries agreed to share the Nobel Peace Prize for 1978 as a part of the agreement. These events ultimately led to Sadat's assassination on October 6, 1981 by Islamic extremists. Violence mounted in the 1980s as Palestinians clashed with Jewish settlers in the occupied territories. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon to dislodge the PLO. In 1987, Palestinian residents of Gaza and the West Bank launched a series of violent demonstrations against Israeli authorities known as the Intifada, or shaking off. Shortly after, Jordan's King Hussein renounced all administrative responsibilities for the West Bank, thereby strengthening the PLO's influence there. As the Intifada raged on, Yasser Arafat proclaimed an independence. An independent Palestine state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip on November 15, 1988. 1 month later, he denounced terrorism, recognizing the state of Israel's rights to exist and authority to begin the land for peace negotiations with Israel. Israel refused to open direct talks with the PLO, but in 1991, Israeli diplomats met with a joint Jordanian and Palestinian delegates at the Madrid Peace Conference. In 1992, Labor Party leaders Yitzhak Rabin became Israel's prime minister, and he vowed to move quickly on the peace progress. He froze new Israeli settlements in the occupied territory and authorized secret negotiations between Israel and the PLO that began in January 1993 and in Oslo, Norway. These talks resulted in several key agreements and led to historic peace accord of September 13, 1993. On the south lawn of the White House that day, Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres and PLO Foreign Policy official Hamad Abbas signed the Declaration of Principles on the Interim Self-Government Arrangements. The accord called for the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, town of Jericho, and the establishment of the Palestinian government that would eventually be granted authority over much of the West Bank. President Bill Clinton over the ceremony, and more than 3,000 onlookers, included former President George Bush and Jimmy Carter, watched in amazement as Arafat and Rabin sealed the agreement with a handshake. Old bitter enemies had met for the first time at the White House reception that morning. In his remarks, Rabin, a former top-ranking Israeli army general, told the crowd, "We, the soldiers who have returned for the battle stained with blood, we who have seen our relatives and friends killed before our eyes, we who have fought against you, the Palestinians, we say to you today in a loud, clear voice, enough blood and tears. Enough." And Arafat, a guerrilla leader who for decades was targeted for assassinations by Israeli agents, declared that the battle for peace is the most difficult battle of our lives. It deserves our utmost efforts because the land of peace yearns for a just and comprehensive peace. Despite attempts to external extremists on both sides to sabotage the peace process with violence, Israelis completed their withdrawal from Gaza Strip and Jordan in May 1994. In July, Arafat entered Jericho amid much Palestinian jubilation and set up his government to the Palestinian Authority. In October 1994, Arafat, Yitzhak Rabin, and Shimon Peres were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts in reconciliation. In September 1995, Rabin, Arafat, and Peres signed a peace agreement providing the expansion of Palestinian self-rule in the West Bank for the democratic elections to determine the leadership of the Palestine Authority. Just over a month later, on November 4, 1995, Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish extremist at a peace rally in Tel Aviv. Peres became prime minister and pledged to continue peace process. However, terrorist attack by Palestinians extremists in early 1996 swayed Israeli public opinion, and in May, Benjamin Netanyahu of the right-wing Likud party was elected prime minister. Netanyahu instead insisted that Palestinian Authority Chairman Arafat meet his obligations and end terrorism by Palestinian extremists. By sporadic attacks continued and peace process stalled. In May 1999, Ehud Barak, a Labour Party, defeated Netanyahu in the national elections and pledged to take bold steps to forge a comprehensive peace in the Middle East. However, extended negotiations with the PLO ended in failure in July 2000, when Barak and Arafat failed to reach an agreement at the summit at Camp David, Maryland. In September 2000, the worst violence since the Intifada broke out between Israelis and Palestinians over Likud leader Ariel Sharon visited Temple Mount, the holiest Islamic site in Jerusalem, seeking a strong leader to suppress the bloodshed. Israelis elected Sharon prime minister in February 2021. Although Arafat pledged to join in America's war on terrorism after the attacks of September 11, 2001, he was not able to garner favor with U.S. President George W. Bush, who was strongly pro-Israel. In December 2001, after a series of Palestinian suicide attacks on Israel, Bush did nothing to stop Israel as it reconquered areas of the West Bank and occupied parts of Ramallah, effectively imprisoning Arafat and the Palestinian Authority headquarters. After Israel dismissed an alternative peace plan put forth by Arab League in September 2002, Palestinian attacks increased, causing Israel to again turn to military intervention in the West Bank. A cycle of terrorist attacks, IFD reprisals, and failed diplomacy continued for the next 2 years. In the late October 2004, reports surfaced that Arafat was seriously ill, and he was flown to Paris for treatment, and in early November fell into a coma. He was pronounced dead on November 11th. Mahmoud Abbas became the new chairman of the PLO and was elected president of the Palestinian Authority in January 2005. The next year, Hamas, seen by many observers as a terrorist organization, one control of the Palestinian legislative body, complicating any potential negotiations. Despite an Israeli withdrawal from the disputed Gaza territory and the fact that both sides ostensibly are committed to a two-state solution, peace in the region remains elusive. I want to thank you for watching today and bearing with me. This was a long one, and I want you to stay blessed and stay safe, and remember to smile, because I love you, but more importantly, God loves you. Bye. I'll see you in my next video.